So today I'm talking about the emergence of gender systems from classifier systems in oceanic languages. So a quick overview. We think that we're comparing gender and classifier systems, and we think that where gender comes from is one pathway to grammaticalization is from classifier systems. So I'll explain a bit more about this, and we've come up with a, yep. Oh, is it? Oh, okay. Is that better? Okay. I'll switch this way so I can actually see what I'm looking at then. Something came on the screen. That's okay. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the pathway from noun to classifier to gender. I'm going to be talking about our idea of what optimal categorization is, and then looking at our experiments that we're conducting on 6 different oceanic languages, and then talk a little bit about our initial data. Okay, we've got quite a big project team. So myself, Greville Corbett and Alison Grandison, back in the University of Surrey. We've got a big range of consultants and stakeholders from across the world. And just like to say a quick thank you to Anne Dot, who's been absolutely fantastic in facilitating all of the work here in New Caledonia as well, and mainly doing all the work, actually. So, well, I sit back and eat pain au chocolat. Okay, so gender systems are usually based on biological sex, such as in Spanish or Russian. This is the majority of choice for about 3/4 of the world's languages that have gender. So out of the WALS survey of 256 languages, about half of the languages have a gender system, with about 3/4 being sex-based. But there are other possibilities. There are sort of human versus non-human, or animate versus non-animate. And then these languages with gender are split roughly 50-50 between a formal and semantic assignment system. So assignment for a noun to a gender based on semantics and on the phonological form, or on just a strict semantic basis. And our claim is that the new systems always seem to be semantic. So the newer languages with a newer gender system will come from just the semantic-only pathway before they formalize and use a formal assignment system. So debate about where gender has come from has been going on for a few years now. But most people were talking about where Indo-European gender comes from, but that's lost far back in the midst of time. And so it wasn't until the 70s when Greenberg talked about Yengi Shemri, an Australian language spoken in the Daly River area of northern Australia, talked about a language. So Yengi Shemri has a gender system and it has a classifier system, and it has added new gender distinctions from its classifier inventory. So we think that's a really good starting point, but we wanted to try and find languages which don't already have a gender system, which show signs of emerging gender. So yeah, we think Greenberg's hypothesis is correct, but we also want to answer some big questions, such as why would languages relinquish such a useful, semantically transparent classifier system in favor of some sort of grammatical gender system that's a bit more of a rigid assignment system, and in part apparently unmotivated for formal reasons. So we obviously needed a field site where we could find some form of emergent gender or new gender systems being developed within a set of closely related languages as a proxy for time depth, with sufficient speakers to conduct our psycholinguistic experiments. And yay, we found it. So we're looking at 6 different languages spoken in Vanuatu and New Caledonia. We've chosen these languages because they vary in the inventory size of the classifiers that they have. So from 2 in Murray up in Santo, and we have 3 classifiers in Lewo on Epi. Then Vatlongos has 4, which is also known as Southeast Ambrym. Northumbrian has 5 classifiers. Nilemwa and Yai have the highest amount of classifiers with 13 and 23. Now, they don't only just vary in the size of the inventory, but also they have classifiers with either simple semantics, so one-to-one relationship of semantics to the type of noun that it classifies, but also complex semantics as well. So languages like Lewo, where you have a drinkable classifier, which you can have houses and clothes assigned to that as well. And these languages also represent various stages of grammaticalization along our pathway from noun to classifier to gender, we think. So the classifier systems we're looking at are just the possessive classifier systems that are found in the oceanic languages. A quick example here is one from Northumbrian, which has 5 classifiers that occur in the indirect possessive construction, where the possessor pronominal is attached to the classifier, and and the possessed noun is on the right-hand side. So we have in Northumbrian 5 different classifiers, one for edible items, one for drinkable items, one for firewood, one for baskets, and one for everything else. Starting from our starting point, we're looking at how nouns can turn into classifiers. So Nouvelle has a good system here. So we can have a non-possessed noun such as boat in 8a. Well, it's probably number 1 actually. First example. No, I don't know what number it is now. I didn't change the numbers. Okay, so we have a non-possessed noun such as boat. We can also have a directly possessed noun where the possessor attaches directly to the possessed noun here. So my boat, different form, and we can combine these together to get some sort of incipient or emergent classifier in an appositional phrase such as my boat, my sailing boat. These constructions only occur with a modified noun, and you can't have these two here without this. You have to have some sort of modification element. So these aren't the same as classifiers. These are incipient or emergent classifiers. In Lewo, in EPI, we have a very standard relational classifier system where the noun can be assigned to different classifiers dependent on your intentional use of the item. So we can have water that occurs with the drinkable classifier, her water for drinking, or if it's for anything else, it's her water, her general possessed water. So we have the different classifiers being used here to show the different intentional usage. Northumbrian, however, we argue has a strict assignment system, which is representative of a gender-style fixed assignment system, where a noun typically only occurs with just one classifier. So we have her water with the drinkable classifier, but we cannot have her water with the general classifier. So here we sort of lose the distinction. For drinking, it's used water for any purpose you want. But even relational classifier systems, there's even a number of nouns that always sort of have some sort of fixed assignment system. So in EPI, which is the example I just gave you in Lewo, which has the relational classifier system, there are some nouns that are stuck with a particular classifier. So some kinship terms are always with the edible classifier. Items used for food preparation, such as saucepan, spoon, and plate, with the edible classifier, clearly non-edible items. And also clothes that are worn over the upper body are with the drinkable classifier. And they don't seem to occur with any other classifier. So these are sort of, again, fixed assignment system. But Northumbrian seems to take more of an extreme view, and most things seem to be fixed. We are trying to look at optimal categorization in our project. So which of these systems is the most optimal, which is the most cognitively efficient type of classification system found in Oceanic languages? So basically, classifier and gender systems, they work as a means of categorization, which is a tool for understanding the world around us. So effective categorization systems, they need to be simple in order to minimize cognitive load, and they also need to be informative to maximize communicative efficiency. So in our view, according to Oceanic languages, a simple system is a language which has a few classifiers, a few forms. And a complex system is a language such as Yai, which has 23 classifiers. An informative system is going to be one that has a one-to-one mapping of form to semantics. So where, for instance, the drinkable classifier only classifies drinkable entities, where a less informative system is going to be one like Lewo, which has houses and clothes, also with the drinkable classifier as well. So we've designed a suite of different experiments to be conducted over the next couple of years. I'm just still in the middle of data collection at the moment, so I've just came back from EPI on Friday. And we're going to do another language, Nouvelle, up in the north of Nouvelle-Calédonie, starting on Monday. So we've collected data from 5 languages so far. Each of our tests is sort of designed to look at the origin, what's the structure, what's the system as it stands now. Are they classifier systems? Do they have a free variable assignment, or do they have a fixed assignment system like a gender system? And to find out different ways that we can talk about these things as being gender or classifier systems, such as anaphoric reference in reference tracking, which can give us an idea of whether or not we have some sort of morphosyntactic agreement system. We want to look at how these are being used as well. What's the semantic domains of these classifiers? How flexible or stretches the system with typical and atypical possessions or typical and atypical interactions, and obviously to discover what optimal complexity is in these languages. What's the most cognitively efficient system? So far this year we've tested three different experiments. Free listing, where the participant hears a classifier and gives us a list of nouns that are associated with the classifier. This gives us an idea of sort of what's overlaps and what's the most typical noun that occurs with the classifier. Card sorting as well, which is a set of pictures where participants have to put according to their classifier categories, and also some video vignettes, which are little video clips which are testing whether or not a particular noun can be used with different classifiers. And because I haven't had much time to look at the data yet, I'm just going to show you some results from the video vignettes. Okay, yeah. So this is I'll just explain the rest of the experiments as well. So next year we're going to be looking at possessive labeling as well, which is where a participant will hear a noun and has to classify it, and we'll look at reaction times there as well. And we expect very typically possessed nouns to be classified quite quickly, whereas atypical possessions to be classified slower, but also with perhaps a variable choice of classifier. We're also looking at eye tracking as well, where participants hear a classifier and then they look at the screen and they see congruent and incongruent pictures, congruent with the classifier or incongruent to the classifier that they hear, to see what they're looking at and to see if there's any difference in that. And that's going to be targeting the languages with either complex semantics as well, and to see if one of the items is more typical. So is house more typically associated with a drinkable classifier, or drinks or liquids are. Also looking at storyboards, which are a suite of pictures where participants will look at anaphoric reference. So for example, we'll have a suite of pictures where we have Jack and Jill go and collect their water, and Jack drinks his and Jill washes with hers, where we don't have the possessed noun repeated, but the classifier is used as an anaphoric referent, and with that we can see whether or not the classifier choice is exactly the same as the initial classifier choice. If it's the same for the different types of interactions, then it's more of a fixed assignment gender style system, but if they vary, then it's more of a classifier type system. Finally, we want to abstract these systems, and we're going to train English speakers on these systems, whereby English speakers will have to learn these abstracted systems and are then given some sort of sorting task, and hopefully we'll get some sort of objective data as to which one of these systems is more easy to learn, which we can come up with a wonderful idea of which of these systems is more cognitively optimal. That's a long way off. That's in year 3. So I'll just skip these because I've explained the pile sorting things. So I'll look at the video vignettes. So basically, we've been working with we aim to work with 22 different speakers of each of these languages. And for the languages we've so far, we worked with, about 22 to 24 for the languages in Vanuatu, only about 15 to 17 in New Caledonia. So it's a lot of work. So the aim of the videos is to test classifier overlap and look at interspeaker variation. And I'll give you an example of what the videos are and what the participant has to do. So here we have, so the target sentence here would be, he is drinking his water. So we ask the participants to always include a possessive classifier when they're describing the event, and also to keep their descriptions very short. And then in this one, he is washing with his water. So do we get a drinkable classifier for the drinking? Do we get a general classifier for the washing? Or do we get the same? So what are the results? Okay, so here are the percentages along the side. As I said, about 20 to 24 participants each for the first 4 languages. EI, the New Caledonian language, about 15 to 17 data points. Sometimes you don't get the exact same comparative data points, so they're just rough. That's why I've done it in percentages. these four languages, pretty much consistent choice for the drinkable classifier and drinking with water. Murray only has two classifiers. It's combined the drinking and the edible classifier together and has a consumable classifier. That's why it's a different color, but it's doing exactly the same thing. There's a bit more of a shift to the general classifier, though, in Murray. I did find a lot of people would just always seem to use the general classifier, regardless of the interactional semantics. But yeah, mostly drinkable classifier. It's what we expect, or consumable classifier. With washing with water, we get a shift to the general classifier with all of the languages except Northumbrian, which is as we expected. Northumbrian has much more of a fixed assignment system, but we do get still some drinkable with that Longos and Lewel. Some of the participants did say, well, you know, if it's his water for drinking, but he's washing with it, it's still going to be the drinkable classifier. So that might be one good explanation for why that has happened. For eating mangoes, we get the edible classifier or the consumable classifier across the board as well. A few people chose the drinkable classifier, as mangoes can be seen as drinkable. And when we had a very ripe and juicy mango that was being sucked, in most of the languages, again, we get a shift to the drinkable classifier. We don't get much of a change in Malay because it's a consumable classifier anyway. It doesn't do anything different. But Northumbrian stayed as edible. But interestingly, Northumbrian, you cannot use the verb drink for mangoes, even if they're nice and juicy. You could only drink the juice of the mango, which is a different possessed noun. So it's as if they've effectively taken out a whole chunk of nouns that could quite happily be drinkable and have reassigned them to just the edible, whereas all the other languages are quite happy to have drinkable mangoes without reference to sort of juice or the water of the mango. Malay is a bit like Northumbrian, but the effects are sort of washed out because they're always going to use a consumable classifier anyway. So half the people said, well, you can't drink the mango, you could only eat it, but the classifier does the same anyway. Okay, some more interactions. So eating eggs, everybody use the edible classifier. With selling eggs, which we expect to shift to the general classifier, we get that overwhelmingly in Yai. Northumbrian, as we said, it's doing its own thing and it's just a fixed assignment system. So egg will only ever occur with the edible classifier, regardless of how you're using it. Vatlongus has an extra classifier, land classifier, so anything that's raised or cultivated on your ground. And this is used instead of the general classifier here. And Lewa and Malay to varying degrees as well use the general classifier. But you know, it's still quite a high shift to the general classifier, so they are still good classifier systems. What happens with atypical interactions? I'm going to force you guys to watch this, because I've had to watch this 100 times now. I got this from YouTube. He's not a friend of mine. Yeah, it's pretty shocking. It turns my stomach, but thankfully I've seen it enough times now to withstand that. So what do we expect is going to happen? Do we expect a shift to the drinkable classifier in such an atypical interaction, or do we still expect them to use a edible classifier or a general classifier? What are the choices? Well, there's much more variation in the results. There is still a lot of shift to the drinkable classifier, but varying degrees so. So Lewo only slightly, less than 50% shifts, and then the rest have used, the rest of the Lewo speakers use an edible classifier. There is some more shift to a general classifier, so they just don't want to say it's drinkable or edible. They just want to avoid any sort of semantics. Similar to Vatlongos and Yai as well. Northumbrian, overwhelmingly edible still, but there is some switch to drinkable, some switch to edible. So the edges of this system, the sort of atypical interactions, it's a bit more classifier-like. But in the center of the system, it's much more of a fixed assignment system. Yeah, and the similar sort of thing is happening in these classifier systems, such as for Lewa, Murray, Vatlongos, and Yai. The center of the system is very much a relational classifier system, but as soon as you go out of your comfort zone, people are a bit unsure of what to do. Okay, so just a brief summary now. So Murray, Leeuwen, Vadlongos, and Yai have high degree of overlap in very typical interactions, and much less so in atypical interactions. Whereas Northumbrian has well, low or no overlap in typical interactions, and also some low degree of overlap in atypical interactions. So why is Northumbrian different? Well, that's one thing we want to try and find out. We don't have the answers yet, but we do think it's probably a frequency of collocation. So if we're looking at corpus counts between classifier and noun, such that always, you know, if you're always talking about your pigs in an edible context, that's why you're always going to get the edible classifier, and they've become sort of fixed. And yeah, one thing, yeah, and there's probably some sort of restrictions on different sort of interactional semantics lead to this fixed classifier noun pairing. So as I said, you can't drink a mango, therefore you could never have a drinkable mango, and that's, again, sort of wipes out a huge inventory, a huge number of the nouns that could be classified as drinkable, and puts those in another system. So we think there's sort of very sort of bizarre sort of semantics that are affecting these systems. We want to, obviously, this is just one of the experiments we've done, and we want to sort of tie this into all the different experiments we're doing as well. But with the vignettes, we want to look at intra-speaker variation. Are there some speakers who are more happy to use their system in atypical interactions as a classifier type system, or less so? Is there any predictability from the verbal semantics? Or I think that's less so for Northumbrian, because you can have the eating verbs with a drinking verb with a general classifier, or so on and so forth. But they're much more predictable in languages like Leeuwen. We also want to compare this with overlap in our free listing experiment as well, which we're using as a proxy for corpus counts, and to see if there's any sort of overlap there. And then we want to look at some social linguistic factors. Are these systems changing with younger generations, and so on? Just a big thank you. I was going to put some nice pictures, but I didn't get time. So just a big thank you to the 109 participants that I've worked with so far across the 5 languages, and got another language next week to work on. So hopefully we'll get 22 there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. There is any question?
I have one. Hello. Thank you, Mike, for this intriguing and appetizing talk.
Sorry, it's probably put you off your lunch now.
That's why I don't want lunch anymore. Okay, I have a question about the methodology of the questionnaire or the vignettes you used. Because what we see through the English translation is, you know, edible versus drinkable. But those categories are embedded in the language in possessive marking. So you know, did you show the video and say and ask, is it a drink? Is this egg drinkable? Probably not. Or did you use it embedded in a sentence, in an utterance?
No. So okay.
And then what I was wondering is maybe the results might differ depending on what exactly the utterance looked like. So he had his eggs. I mean, he was doing, you know, his eggs, and lo and behold, he drank them. So I could imagine he had his edible eggs, because that's the sort of default coding of possession, and then he drank them with a sort of surprise effect in the second sentence. But the sort of noun phrase would be edible, whereas maybe he drank his eggs might give you different results.
Okay, so we presented the videos to the participants. We just asked them to describe what's happening in the video. We don't give them any sort of sentence or anything like that. We ask them to be very precise and give a very short description, so not to describe every small action. So we try and say, you know, what's the main result, or what's the main action that's happening here. Because they're watching 24 different videos, they sort of pick up on that after a couple of videos normally. But some people do ignore the instructions and give very, very long and detailed descriptions. We do have things like that where the classifier choice changes, like you're saying. So he's cracking his edible eggs, and then normally they just say, and then he drinks. Yes. And they don't, you know, put any other noun phrase on the end. Then I ask them, well, okay, could we shorten this sentence? How can I just sort of describe the main action? And how would I say, say this in Bishlama, or Anlo says this in French, so there's no, we don't evoke any classifier. We say, well, could you translate this? Is this a good description of what's happening? He's drinking his eggs. And that way we don't offer any classifiers. We want them to come up with a classifier on their own. And so often we can see some sort of scope change as well. So if they do offer the long sort of sentence as well, like he's cracking his edible eggs and then he drinks his drinkable eggs, we do see that as well.
Or there might be in some cases some priming effect that if he used the edible in the previous sentence, he might.
Yes, there could be priming effects, but we try and avoid that
fine.
by
I mean,
randomizing. Every participant sees a different randomized order of the videos.
Okay.
So that should be a minimal effect.
Okay.
Une autre question.
Manfred?
Yeah, one can ask about the function of gender systems, and with non-possessive gender systems like in European languages, Bantu and so on, one function is that it provides a certain number of differentiated anaphoric devices, pronouns like that are differentiated, and when telling a story also you can make use of that. Now I don't know how often this anaphoric use occurs with possessive classifiers. It does occur, but certainly not as frequent as in French, learned la and so on. So I don't know whether you have any idea about the function of this system.
Yeah, well they do. I mean, from what I've seen in the Northumbrian corpus, I have 3 or 4 examples of that happening. It doesn't happen very often, but it always seems to match whatever was in the antecedent, whatever the use was in the antecedent. I can't think off the top of my head, but there was something about he caught his bird using the edible classifier, and a few sentences later he ate his bird, or he ate his without the noun, possessed noun. And the classifier matches the classifier used previously. And that's mainly because in Northumbrian we have this fixed assignment system. So this is why we're sort of arguing this is more like a gender system, because this is agreement, basically. This is morphosyntactic agreement within the anaphoric reference system. In Lewa, I've seen it, I have to ask for these sentences because they don't have a corpus for Lewa. They then can switch the classifier. They can have it different from the antecedent. So like that example I gave with the storyboards that we want to train next year, they get their water, they would have, they could choose either, I guess they could choose the general or the drinkable water for fetching it, and then they can quite happily change the classifier. He drank his and she washed with hers, and that changes. So that shows it's a nice, these are classifier systems and they changed, and it's not an agreement system, whereas Northumbrian has this more agreement style to it. But yeah, they don't occur very often. That's why we want to use the storyboards as a method for getting these sentences next year.